Derivative. Jack uses big words.
Oh.
Hello, and welcome back to Cargo Cafe. As always, I'm your host, Libby Hausman. I'm joined by Wiles. We're really excited for today's show. We have an awesome guest here to talk about a really good topic, and we just think it's going to be one of our best ones. So, Riley, how are you doing today?
Doing good. I agree with you. Super excited to have Noah coming on board today. One of the smartest dudes I've met definitely recently. So super excited to hear what he has to say.
Yeah, we think this is going to be a really good one. Before we dive into our interview, I wanted to give a quick update on the tariff situation from our Vice President, Jack McDonough. Obviously, there's been a lot of recent announcements and changes, so we just want to make sure we're keeping everyone up to date. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to your Bestway rep or any one of us, and we'll do our best to get you those answers. So as things stand today, there's still a 10% universal IEEPA tariff that has been extended until August 1st. We're unsure what's going to happen on August 1st. There's kind of been some mixed signals out there. Most likely, it'll be a variety of different country-specific rates. Numbers that have been thrown around for the EU, Canada, and Mexico are 30%. Again, all of that is just kind of speculation, and we will know more on August 1st. And that would also be additive to any other duties and tariffs that are applied for those countries. Trade deals have been reached with the UK, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. However, there is still that 10% reciprocal tariff for those countries. There's also been tentative deals reached with Vietnam and Indonesia, with Vietnam at a 20% tariff unofficially, and Indonesia at the 19% rate. China is still subject to the 20% IEEPA tariff, which the other countries are not subject to. So the effective baseline duty rate coming from China is 30% versus that 10% for other countries. There was a temporary reduction to 10% on the reciprocal tariff, still valid through August 1st, or August 12th, apologies. We're unsure what's going to happen after that, but we should know more on that day. There are still exemptions allowed for certain tech products and semiconductors. Also, the Section 232 duties on steel and aluminum, as well as derivative products of steel and aluminum, were increased globally from 25% to 50% on the value of the steel or aluminum in the article. In addition to this increase, there was a loophole where non-steel or aluminum value of derivative products were exempt from the IEEPA tariff that has been closed, meaning that the steel and aluminum value of a derivative product is tariffed at 50%, while the remaining value of the product is tariffed at its applicable IEEPA tariff, which is 10% for most countries and 30% for China. So obviously that's a lot of information. Things are changing rapidly. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us at Bestway, and we'll do our best to let you know with what we know. But as we all know, that's kind of a moving target right now. We're all just doing our best.
That was a lot.
That was a lot.
Good
but
update.
Yes, we're doing our best to really just push out as much information as possible and provide education. We want to be a resource for everyone. We have questions. You have questions. Let's get together and see what we can figure out. So without further ado, I'm going to let Riley introduce Noah, and we'll bring him on the screen and get started.
Awesome. Noah spent 5 years at Flexport, working his way from a sales development role to senior GTM in sales leadership positions. Over the course of his tenure, Noah maintained over 100% quota attainment across SDR, full cycle sales rep, first and second line management roles. After leaving Flexport, Noah spent time at Nuvo, leading the sales development function to 4x year-over-year revenue growth. Now, Noah leads operations for Revenue Vessel and is laser focused on helping companies grow their top of funnel at warp speed. And breaking news only on Cargo Cafe, Mr. Noah is expecting his first child, I just found out. So he's got a lot more things to worry about than, tariffs and what all's going on with data and stuff right now. But with that, let's bring Noah on board.
Hello.
Hey, Noah, how are you doing?
Doing well. It's good to be here.
Good. That was a great introduction to Riley. Yeah.
Yeah, Riley, thank you. I appreciate you couching one of the smartest people I've met recently. Yeah,
Recently.
what I can commit to is that this is the smartest guy I've met in the last month or two. So
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
No, we met last October. I've run into quite a few people since then. You're way up there.
Well, I appreciate the chance to be here with you all. Really excited to jump in and we'll talk through data and all things supply chain. It's been a crazy few weeks.
Yeah, we're really excited. Ooh, got a congratulations from Ms. Kelly Adkins.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, she's the best.
Yeah, it's going to be tough to top, expecting your first child, but we're going to try to hit some really cool stuff here and see how close we can get. How about that?
Yeah, so let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing that we want to talk to you about is going to be the origins and vision of Revenue Vessel.
So I am always fascinated, Noah, when starting new businesses, just find a weakness in a industry, whatever it may be. So what was the moment that sparked the idea for Revenue Vessel?
So Brian, who's our CEO, and Danny kind of like started working on this idea on the back of some work that we did at Flexport. I think if you look at like the industry problem we were hoping to address and still are hoping to address, it's that freight, if we're honest, is like it's a commodity, right? It's we buy it and then we price in margin to kind of cover providing the best possible customer support, et cetera. But the average buyer doesn't have the same accessibility to the freight market that they do to gas or travel with an airline or whatever else. And that can produce maybe inefficiencies in the market, or maybe people aren't using companies like Bestway, right? And they don't realize that better options are out there because it's really hard to sort of know who's available to work with. And so what Revenue's Vessel is focused on doing is saying, how do we really map out the market of people that are buying freight to help freight companies be able to get their offerings in front of as many people as possible and really kind of help price the market fairly, as well as demonstrate to new importers, who are the best possible candidates for their business, right? So it really is like, it's kind of like the economic nerdy side it's a market efficiency play. How do we make supply and demand meet as efficiently as possible? But what I think is exciting from an importer perspective, if you're a shipper, you're somebody who's moving freight, this market hasn't really allowed for people to break into new accounts very easily. It's just who do you know, and that's it. And so the opportunity for more people to email you and reach out and ask for your business gives you more exposure to what are rates available in the market and who are great partners for you to potentially be working with.
Yeah, that's and sounds like just narrowing your focus there, right? I mean, it's a very large industry. You could get lost in the weeds, calling a whole bunch of people that you might not make a whole lot of sense for. But Revenue Vessel and what you guys are doing, you can really narrow that down to, we are really good at this. This is specifically what we're looking at, and let's go talk to those people as well. Very cool.
Absolutely.
So what's on the horizon for Revenue Vessel, and specifically, how might that benefit importers directly?
Yeah, so I think one of the next things that we're really thinking through is AI has come a long ways over the last few years. We're probably maybe even a little tired of hearing the word AI, but if you look at what AI as a concept could do when ChatGPT came out 2-3 years ago, to right now, just incredible improvements in terms of what AI can do. And what we're really focused on is saying, hey, we've done this job of mapping out what the market looks like. Now, how do we use AI tooling to really get the right solutions in front of the right people every time? To what you pointed out, Riley, it's if Bestway knows, hey, look, these are the lanes that we're really excellent at. Here are origin partners that we can really depend on. Being able to use AI to kind of efficiently align you with the right importers. And so the benefit to importers is hopefully over time, the outreach you're getting is less of this, spray and pray from forwarders saying, I've got a rate for you. Let's see if we can get you a competitive rate. It's, hey, I did specific research on you. I know that you work on these lanes. These are really excellent lanes for us. We can get you competitive rates with really excellent partners, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I really like how you describe Revenue Vessel as kind of a map of the market. I think that's a really good way to look at it. It has so much data that you can sort through, which can be really overwhelming. But when you have kind of one platform where you can go and find a specific subset of data, I think that can be really beneficial for, freight partners as well as the companies themselves being able to map out maybe their forecasting, see what competitors are doing, and kind of get a better idea of the market as a whole. So I think it's a really good analogy.
Yeah, that's great.
That's awesome. Yeah, so kind of we touched on it a little bit. I want to get more into specifics for importers and kind of your perspective on that, and talk about the challenges and pain points for importers. So I think we're going to get into that next.
Cool.
So from your perspective, what do you see as being the biggest pain points that importers are faced when dealing with freight partners?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at like wider term, the wider term pain point, I would say like latency is the big one. Let's start here. There's a couple building blocks right out the gate, right? It's like, hey, are we getting a competitive rate? Like, are we getting totally screwed over and we don't realize it? Okay, fine. If rate is within reason, like that's a good baseline. And then are we working with a partner that's trusted, certified, et cetera, compliant is the second bucket. But once those two buckets are done, and there's plenty of freight partners to pick from where you're going to get a competitive rate with a compliant forwarder, the next really big bucket where I feel like most of the breakdown happens is on latency. It's like latency of communication, latency of operations looping, et cetera, where your freight partners are really, from my perspective, like freight, and I'm sure most people would agree, freight is a giant relay race, right? We've got 45 different sets of hands that are going to touch goods from the moment that it leaves a loading dock to the moment that it arrives at a final destination. And where people win and lose is how well they manage the latency between those touch points. So it's a little, we can kind of talk through some of the data points that are important to track when managing latency. But I think the critical piece here is like, you want a partner that's really proactive in how they communicate with you and how they're communicating with their other partners in the supply chain, right? And you can view their communication with you as an indication of how communicative they are with all the other partners they work with. As like a professional relay racer, how fast they're talking back and forth with you is going to indicate how well they are working as a partner with all the other people that they engage with in the supply chain process. So to me, that's probably the biggest potential issue that gets faced. And then we could kind of talk through invoicing and things like that, and some of those more table stakes things. But I think like latency is the big bucket.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You mentioned kind of the data points that you see that helps people manage that latency. What would you say some of those key data points are?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the latency piece, the high level overarching one would be like transit time. And so specifically what I like to look at, like if you're an importer and you're making decisions on freight and maybe you don't have the data infrastructure built out, the easy thing for you to start tracking immediately is, hey, when I book a shipment with a forwarder, what is the estimated transit delivery time that I'm being given? And then what's the actual once it actually lands? And start tracking that to be able to say, hey, look, how well are they hitting the targets that they offer to us? There's a lot of variables when it comes to the supply chain side of things. I'd be less concerned with, how fast are my goods coming from rural China to just outside of Kansas City, and more concerned with is my freight partner hitting the transit time that they're committing to me, right? And if they're not, how far are they off on that? That feels like an easy one to immediately take advantage of without too much work. And then from there, being able to kind of break down additional SLAs throughout the supply chain gets really interesting over time. So depending on connectivity with your freight partners and your own internal infrastructure, starting to break out nodes by sections of the supply chain and saying, how accurate is my supplier's cargo ready date timeline? Once we have those cargo ready date timelines, how quickly are we moving goods from CRD to gate in date, right? And then from gate in to delivery at the destination port, and just kind of starting to break down those subsets of the supply chain would be the next thing. But that's where I would start. Like, let's start with arrival time, and then let's break down the various parts of the supply chain, and then from there you can really start to hone in on areas and opportunities for efficiency improvements.
Yeah, I think that's really good. It's interesting when you talk about data in a sense of using the data to evaluate how your communication goes. I think that's not where most people's brains go to. They just think, well, we have, good emails back and forth, and, I love talking to this person. But when you really dig into the data, kind of looking at how that goes hand in hand with how your communication style is going and using that to make effective decisions, I think is a really, really good point.
Yeah, that's something I would call out too. Like, as somebody who cold called my fair share of importers, everyone always says we've had a partner for X fill in the blank number of years and we're happy with them.
Yep.
And then my follow-up question is always, how do you know that you're happy with them, right? Like, if you've been using them for 10 years and you haven't benchmarked against the industry, you have very little idea whether or not the rates you're getting are still competitive, whether the communication turnaround times are as effective as they need to be, right? It's really important to kind of stay in touch with the market and be open to exploring new providers for sure.
Yeah, kind of building off that same thing, you touched on it a little bit, but what kind of signals should importers look with their own shipping patterns to kind of know when it's time to optimize and rethink their strategies?
Yeah, so I would say a few different things to be mindful of, and this could be like, how do you work with your existing freight partner to really deepen the relationship? But right now, starting off our conversation today, we started with the conversation on tariffs, right? And I think volatility here, it makes it really hard to know when it's time to switch sourcing locations and think about origin side impacts, but just keeping a really close eye on how tariffs are evolving, and specifically not so much when the headlines break on a new tariff landing, because there's been a decent amount of volatility in what gets announced and then what's actually impacted. But specifically when you're looking at your customs entry information and you're starting to see the impact of it show up there, when your freight partner is telling you, hey, we're actually seeing this show up in internal systems with ACE or the CBP, that's when that actually becomes reality, right? It's one thing for Trump to make the initial announcement on Truth Social or wherever, but it's a separate thing for it to actually get implemented at a Customs and Border Patrol level, and that's the part where it actually impacts your business. So in that gap, there's a lot of panic in the headlines, and so kind of watching when things actually hit in reality, I think is really critical. That's what I would say on the tariff side. The two other things that I would say are important is transit time volatility, specifically when your freight partner is not giving you good reasons for it. It's one thing to say, hey, look, this thing showed up way late because we were the unlucky ones with the intensive customs exam this go round. But it's another thing when you start seeing volatility and your partner has very little explanation, and or they're just not providing you support on being able to kind of action and get around the transit time volatility. And then the last thing that I sort of wanted to make sure I mentioned is the rate piece, right? So just making sure that you're continuing to get a fair rate in the market, keeping track of where indexes are at and where the market's at. There's always somebody who's going to price buy you a cheaper rate. So it's not, how do we find the lowest rate imaginable, but am I getting a fair rate with a good partner that I can trust to deliver on the service that they've committed to?
Yeah, I think those are all really important and things that people need to keep in mind when kind of evaluating their supply chain processes and partners. And I think having a platform like Revenue Vessel to be able to go get some of that data quickly and easily is super beneficial. Yeah. So now I kind of want to take it over to talk a little bit more in depth about the data, going into data and visibility and logistics.
Yeah, so Noah, I want to focus on RevVest here. And I thought I'm most excited to hear your answer on this one, because this is entertaining to me. But how do you ensure your contact data stays accurate, especially in the logistics industry where there's high turnover and org charts are changing every day. How are you guys ensuring that data is accurate?
Yeah, great question. So right out the gate, we work with a lot of the contact data providers that you might be familiar with in the industry. So you'll see data that kind of comes from a variety of different contact data providers that are fairly trusted and have their own cleaning process. Our next layer beyond that is how do we really start to kind of connect into importers in the marketplace via a couple methods. One, LinkedIn is the go-to place for people to keep their information up to date. So being able to kind of like check regularly on LinkedIn and sort of refresh the data as people update their job titles is a critical part of the process. But to your point, Riley, there's a lot of people that, maybe are less connected to LinkedIn and the logistics industry. They've been working at a company for a long time. They're not on the job hunt. Maybe they don't update their LinkedIn as frequently. And so the next iteration of the platform for us is to start really diving in on helping with the outreach. And I think, we'll have announcements ourselves on this in the coming months, but the idea is over time, we could start to build touch points directly with importers and then be able to say, hey, we know this firsthand because we called the front desk and Jim no longer works there and Joe took over his job, right? And being able to get that information firsthand, I think is like the most trusted available intel. And that's where we're kind of headed from a roadmap perspective.
Very cool. That's awesome. Now, all that data you guys are bringing in, even beyond contact data, just all the data you guys are bringing in at RedVest, are you guys analyzing that data, or are you just obtaining it and making it available? How are you guys handling all that?
Yeah, we have a decent number of sort of outreach that or I would say like analytic techniques that we use to kind of clean up the initial data. What I would flag from the starting point is that what you'll see on the typical bill of lading data that we get, or we're kind of like taking raw bill of lading data, we're layering in, a handful of other data sources as well, and pulling together this pool that maps out the logistics environment end to end. And what you'll see with like raw bill of lading data is every single time somebody, manually types in a bill of lading, you get like a slightly different variation on the spelling of a company or a name. So to your question, Riley, all of that data then gets run through an engine where we're actually already using AI and LLMs to say, are these entities related, right? So if I'm looking at, as an example, FCA US, which is the importing entity for Chrysler, and then I've got another one that says FCA US operations, and that's the difference in the consignee name. It's not a direct match, but if an LLM looks at that and says, hey, these are very similar names, they're both routing to the same industrial district just outside of Detroit, Michigan, which also happens to be where Chrysler's based, you can start to make really intelligent connections. And that's helpful for importers, right? I've talked to importers directly who said this is interesting to be able to see the entire supply chain because they're dealing with the same fragmentation that we are as freight partners. And so to be able to see that data sort of stored in one place is really helpful insight for them too.
Yeah, that's awesome. So kind of going back to the market here, you have all that data. I'm sure people come to you all the time and say, hey, what's going on in the market? What are you seeing? Are there any key data points that make you say, oh shit, something bad's about to happen, or oh whoa, big shift here? Are there any key data points that you walk in and you're just looking at those, and if there's a big spike or a big decline that make you kind of be able to forecast a little bit about what's coming around the corner?
Yeah, I would say without getting too much into the data acquisition process, we have very fresh data on what's coming into the country. And so it's helpful for us to be able to see, where are the swings happening in the market. The two things that I'm always looking at as like leading indicators of what's happening, just because right now the conversation is trade, tariff war, domestic production, foreign production. What I'm really kind of interested in seeing is how are those things switching in different areas. In different time periods of my time working in the logistics space, I've had different areas of focus, but for me right now, that's what I'm really kind of analyzing personally is the international versus the domestic. So two things that I'm really looking at. One is like aggregate total bookings across the US year over year. So, okay, how many bookings are American importing companies importing into the US booking with ocean carriers against the previous year, where there was less volatility, less of this environment, cetera? Like, are we actually seeing a material reduction of stuff coming into the US? And so that's kind of the first metric. I'm like, that's the oh shit one. And right now it's looking pretty good, but if you rewind to like mid-April when this stuff started breaking, it was like, I'm sure you all were feeling the heat too. It's major change in the booking volumes. So that one, and then the other one that's really interesting to me is change in where the bookings are happening, right? So specifically looking at like the origin country to destination location, congestion is less of a concern. So right now I'm less concerned with like the destination side and more concerned with the origin side, and actually seeing the delta of, take for example, Trump bringing the heat on China. As people feel the heat on the China lane, where are we actually seeing other lanes emerge, right? And we won't see that impact on a dime, but over the coming 6 to 12 months, we'll start to see some of the reduction that we're seeing in China, where China year over year right now, booking volume is down like 20%, right? And so where is that 20% moving? As booking volumes overall stay relatively consistent, we're down like maybe 1%, 2% year over year, but China's down 20%. Where's that 20% shifting to, right? And I think we'll start to see India and Vietnam as maybe potential locations, but where that volume starts to appear is probably one of the more interesting things to me.
Absolutely. Supplier vetting is becoming a big thing, a big topic for us because of all that shifting that's going on right now, for sure.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, as we move into, we want to talk more about how we can use a revenue vessel as a logistics strategy and competitive edge and kind of moving forward with that kind of lens. So we're going to move into that a little bit. Some of the things that people, want to know when you sit down and talk with importers, what do you think surprises them the most when they see their own data or their competitors' shipping patterns visualized in kind of one platform?
Yeah, a few things. On the revenue vessel side, what we're doing is really tracking things at a very high level, and then I can break down some other metrics that are like maybe less revenue vessel specific. I think one of the more interesting things for importers that I've talked to directly is, one, seeing other freight providers that they didn't know were available in their arsenal, right? So if you're talking to buyers at large conglomerates where they're used to working with the two forwarders that their particular department works with, being able to see, our company actually employs 8 different options, right? And so if I'm frustrated with one of the big 3 that we typically go to, there's plenty of other options in the arsenal. And so that's actually really valuable for them to see. And then the other thing is being able to see density on lanes. And so again, like some of these larger conglomerates where things are more fractionalized, you'll see folks say, I thought I was the only one operating on this lane, maybe Puerto Rico to the US, or, Malaysia to the US, where they assume most of the volume is coming out of China. And so being able to see that there's more density on that lane gives them more command in that power relationship with the forwarder. And so those are the things on the revenue vessel side that I think are probably like some of the more like surprising metrics for folks. The second thing that when we start to see the aggregate data at a little bit more of a granular level, so importers may be looking at their own data, is routing inefficiency as one example. So it's one thing to move a single shipment through a strange routing with, take LA congestion as an example, where there's certainly instances where folks were shipping into non-ideal ports and then just running a transload or trucking down to get to the LA market. And on a single 1 to 2 to 3 months of volume, that made sense. But then when you start to look at things in aggregate over a yearly basis and start to see that inefficiency play out, I think it really both surprises importers to realize how much they've been doing that over the last few years, but then it also introduces a really strategic conversation on how do we actually do this systematically. Where in the moment, it's easy to get in the tactics and play whack-a-mole, and we're going to run this shipment into Oakland, we're going to run this one into Seattle, but then starting to build density so that you can then, bid on contract rates instead of floating everything on the spot market, or identify efficient routings rather than being reactive to a given congestion problem, but proactive ahead of time to build that into your supply chain strategy.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think Revenue Vessel does a really nice job of presenting that data in kind of an easy to read platform. So kind of building off of that, do you think that importers should be thinking more of like a data company in terms of when they're managing their freight and analyzing it rather than just, this is what we do and this is how we're going to do it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say definitely so, and I say this like even in my own seat, it's easy when like we work in an industry with a ton of fires. It's so easy to get caught up in the fires and focused on how do I tactically execute whatever my desk is, whatever my job description is, how do I tactically execute it and make sure that it stays excellent. But it's really valuable to say, I'm not just doing this work, but I'm also working on the work as well, right? The self-awareness to say I'm doing the job and I'm thinking about how I do the job and how I do the job better as well at the same time, right? So that second piece is very much like the data company orientation of saying we really want to be able to organize ourselves in like a data company fashion and push into developing like a strategic analysis layer over the top, right? And so that's the thing that I would say is like really critical is building that strategic analysis layer, understanding which elements are really critical for you as an org, and then developing those over time.
Yeah. Yeah. So my last question here, kind of a fun one for you. Do you have a favorite origin or port that you like to track and watch trends in?
I'm a big Savannah fan. I'm a Savannah fan for a few reasons. One, I think Savannah is like one of the most interesting, like to me, it's one of the most unique looking places in the US. It's got this like colonial 17, 1800s feel, but then it's also Southern, which is like very unique, where like most of the South is like generally more later developed. So I just like I enjoy Savannah Port. I like one of my favorite places to visit personally, but I also am kind of like rooting for Savannah as like an underdog in the top three biggest ports in the US. There's no like strategic value there. I just think it's really like I would love to see it grow as a port, and I've loved the infrastructure that they built out over the last 5 to 10 years. Definitely starting to see that for sure. So
Yeah. And as you talk about kind of growing into breaking into the top three, are you seeing it kind of trend upwards in that way, or is that just your own personal hope?
yeah, no, they made a bunch of infrastructure improvements. I don't remember exactly when, but I read about them a few years back. And as a result of that, definitely seeing an increase just because it's become a much more reliable hub in terms of like reduced congestion. And then obviously the LA craziness happened 2, 3 years ago, and so it got even more increase there. And I think I worked with a number of large importers when I was over at Flexport, where they actually made strategic decisions to abandon distribution centers in and around the LA area and built distribution centers around the Savannah area. So I've definitely seen both at an anecdote and like a global level that that's true. I think it'd be pretty hard to unseat LA just because it's LA Long Beach is so convenient against Southeast Asia, but we'll see. Maybe over time.
Yeah. Well, you heard it here first. Keep your eye on Savannah. It's going to be the next big one.
We got to get Noah's sales commission on
I know.
when Savannah blows up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So before we kind of open the floor to some questions from our audience, we want to go over some misconceptions and trends that you're seeing in the market. First things first, I want to ask you, what is a common misconception about logistics performance that you feel like the data proves wrong?
That's a great question.
Spot there, yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe probably one of the biggest ones to me is like a little bit of the pricing game. So something I've kind of seen from a decent number of importers is like a sort of like maybe overly sensitive to pricing impacts, right? Where your freight partner's pricing goes up, and so then you find a cheaper rate, and you assume that that's actually the market rate, and then adjust your strategy, and then move over to a new provider. What I would flag, and something that I think is like worth calling out is. There's a lot of providers that'll give you no margin or negative margin shipments right out the gate because they need the volume. But they can't maintain that sort of pricing over time. And so what I would maybe just kind of raise as something worth calling out is like, I saw a quote in the body of an importer's email once that said, introductory rates are temporary, but freight partners are forever, right? Where like it's kind of like his own ode to, hey, the first rate isn't necessarily the fair market rate, and generally things will correct back to that middle. So what I would say is maybe the inconception there is like, don't assume that your existing provider is giving you maybe let's call it an unfair rate because you see a significantly cheaper rate elsewhere in the market. I think it's better to maybe rely on indexes for that information to gauge where the market's at there. I don't know whether that's like a right on the nose answer, but I think that kind of
I think that's
highlights some of the misconception.
Yeah. No, I think you're all over it there, and I think it just goes back to when you're vetting freight partners. That's a large decision that you're making, and using data as another layer of vetting. Whether you just use it as an index, like, well, they're below for some reason. Why is that? And just diving deeper into it for sure. It's a good answer.
Yeah, I love that quote too. I think we need to get that on a T-shirt or something.
I'll buy one.
Yeah.
Send me the group order.
Yeah. Kind of make sure we credit the original creator. But yeah, that's a really good one.
The other one I'll flag while we're kind of talking about it is, I think there's a second piece around just transit time generally, where importers generally lean in the direction of like, hey, faster is better, right? And so, I think maybe people end up overspending on air freight, or they overspend on, fast boat type services because they're leaning in the direction of faster is better. But like at an aggregate level, if we can really line up consistency instead of faster, right? Like if you can build consistency in the experience that you're receiving from your freight partners, you don't necessarily need the fastest solution, right? It's just like that. You can start to dependably rely on trade lines. Then trade lane timelines. Then you spend less time doing shipments down the line, right? So where fast might feel like the most important metric out the gate, building that consistency so that you can properly plan your supply chain is also critical. So,
absolutely. Last one on misconceptions and trends. We kind of touched on this earlier. What trends are you seeing, those major ones that you're looking at? Now we're looking for your forecast, not just telling us what you're looking at. What trends are you seeing in the data right now that logistics professionals should be paying more attention to?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one I hinted at earlier is the China to US volume. There's a lot of great places to track China to US volume generally, and I think it's really critical to be mindful of this because there's going to be a lot of opportunities that arise out of this, whether it's, eventually reduced rates out of China just because the market softens, or, just thinking through how do you reorient your sourcing strategy or your trade lane strategy based on what you're seeing there. It's just going to have this massive ripple effect. China to US is the largest set of port pairings anywhere in the world in terms of volume, right? So it's just a really critical data point to watch. What I think is most interesting to me is like if you look at the raw data, which I've kind of taken a look at myself, you'll see in the month of April, beginning of May, year-over-year volumes were down like 50% year-over-year, right? Insane impact. I don't know where the impact will be absorbed from a metrics perspective, but that's just like take the largest trade lane in the world, cut it in half. We might still see the results of the stock outs that came from that coming down the line. So I think like from a trend perspective, I'm really watching that closely. We're down to like negative 20% year over year, like I mentioned earlier, but I still think that that's going to have pretty material impact on stock outs, on the American consumer down the line, on importers in terms of rates and pricing. So that's something that I think is really interesting. So that's one thing I'm really watching closely. Another thing that I would say is going to be kind of interesting to kind of see how it evolves is the volume going through carriers directly. This is kind of like a post-COVID thing that I think is kind of interesting. But during the era of COVID, like to the non-freight nerds, there was the spot market. The spot market went through a really volatile shift, and as a result, all the power sat with the freight forwarders, and some of them maybe abused that power, where essentially like you would see this like there was very little capacity in the market. It was like a really precious asset, and so there were people that really did right by their customers, and there were some that didn't. And what I saw as a freight seller coming out of that is that a lot of importers were very jaded by the experience that they had with their freight partners there, and so there was a swing in the direction of direct carrier relationships because it felt like the middleman was like less of a valuable party. Now, what I kind of have seen, having looked over this a little bit more in aggregate, where now we work with, dozens of different freight companies and have kind of seen how this plays out across a bunch of different carriers, is that leaning in the direction of direct carrier relationships is just a really bad call from a diversification perspective. And so it felt like an immediate swing from a pendulum perspective out of COVID. And then a lot of importers got screwed by the fact that they maybe doubled down on carrier relationships too much. And that just introduces a ton of risk and exposure to a specific set of assets, right? It's a non-diversified portfolio. You probably don't go out and just buy NVIDIA, right? Like you probably want to spread your stock portfolio out a bit, and that's what freight partners are really great for. And so that's something that I'm like, I don't have a definitive answer here, but this is something I'm personally really interested in seeing how it evolves, because I think like freight partners are really important diversification play. Bestway is a great example of just like, you diversify yourself across a bunch of carriers. You work with Bestway, you reduce some of the risk of that direct exposure to one single provider in the marketplace.
I thought I was going to have to step in and defend all freight forwarders everywhere there for a second, but you did a nice job. No, those were weird times, and you're spot on. It was a lot of people switch to carrier direct, and you limit your capabilities. And yeah, I think a lot of people are shifting back, and it was a great time to do things the right way. And hopefully we don't face anything like that again anytime soon, but I'm sure we're only moments away.
Yeah, so I want to open up the floor to any audience questions. Anyone watching, if you want to post a question in the chat, we'll get it in front of Noah and make sure we get you an answer. This is a really good time. We have Noah here ready to go. He's a wealth of knowledge about all this stuff. And I think especially right now, as we talk about, tariffs and everything that's happening on kind of a global scale, it's a really good time to be keeping an eye on your data and making sure that you have the most accurate, up-to-date information and you're able to make informed decisions. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. We got a couple more minutes of Noah's time here, and we'll make sure we get those answered for you.
Noah, while we're waiting for the questions to come in, one, it was an absolute honor to break the news on baby number one. Is Cargo Cafe gonna get? Has a name been decided? Are we gonna get that exclusive news as well, or are you guys still deciding?
We're still on the 1 yard line on deciding a name. We'll have to do a follow up. We'll do a follow up sesh. I'm sure there'll be plenty of news headlines between now and then. So we can blend supply chain, and we'll have a name announcement for you.
There you go. Just throwing it out there. Riley is a unisex name. Just if you want to throw stick that name into the hat,
Great. We'll put it down. So
I feel like I knew that was coming. I felt it. He's been sitting on that one this whole time.
Yeah.
Are you mulling with Riley Jr.? If you're a big Riley fan, are you like,
no,
gonna have a Riley Jr.?
No, I wouldn't do that to my kids.
I was gonna say you had
I'm trying to push that off onto other people.
Awesome. Well, we have a couple more minutes. If you do have a question, please feel free to post it below. It can be, give him your best shot, any topic. Nothing's off limits. Hopefully. While we're waiting for some of those to come through, I do want to go ahead and say next month on Cargo Cafe, we're going to be talking about exporting, moving into new markets. So that's going to be a good one to keep an eye out for. Looks like we did just have a question come through. It says, can Noah's tools search for product industry specific import lanes to help buyers potentially find other vendors or others to sell to potentially? That's a great question. Thank you, Kelly.
It is a great question, and I'm kind of mad at myself for not chatting about this sooner. So thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, this is a great way to use this raw ocean data, right? Where it's it's one thing to try to develop your own strategy. It's another thing to be able to look in aggregate across your specific section of the market. Let's say you're, a company that imports apparel, you're in the apparel or textile space, being able to not just build your own strategy, but also say, what is all of the rest of the market doing in response to this volatility is actually really insightful. And so this is something you can do on Revenue Vessel for sure, which is search by specific commodities. And then it's a little harder to produce that in aggregate, but it's something we help our customers with on the back end for sure, which is saying, hey, look, like if I'm looking at the textile space, I'm looking at, tariff two-digit code 50 through two-digit code 63 and saying, like, I really want to get my hands on the apparel and textiles market. And you can kind of analyze that subset of the market and say, where was the volume in that particular HTS code bucket coming from 12 months ago, and where is it coming from now? So you can actually see changes specific to a commodity set in the market.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's a really valuable tool to be able to go look at that and see kind of what other people are doing and the market as a whole in order to make the most informed decision. Kelly's also put her name out there for potential baby names. So I guess that's also what this has become. If you have baby names, throw them in the chat.
Yeah. We'll start a Google form. We'll add it to the chat. You can submit your name, why you think it's the right one.
You have to be able to back it up with a good why, and then it gets bumped up the list. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it looks like we are coming up on 11:45. I don't want to take too much more of your time here, Noah. Really, really appreciate you sitting down and chatting with us. As I mentioned before, August 20th is going to be our next Cargo Cafe. We're going to be talking specifics about exporting, specifically how to decide what new markets to break into. So looking forward to it. We have another awesome guest. Ashley says, no questions, but really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you, Ashley. That's awesome. And if we don't have anything else, we can go ahead and log off. Thanks again, Noah.
Thanks, Noah. Always fun, man.
Thank you all for having me. Enjoyed it.
See you, bud.